This is Second Chance with You, Baxter Boys, Book 4. Written by Jesse Gussman. Performed by J. Dice. Episode 2, Chapters 7 through 10. Chapter 7. Eden walked out on the porch, holding a cup in her hands, followed by Eve.
Hot tea?
No thanks. He was anything but cold. Ever since his phone rang, his heart had been pumping like pistons in a freight train.
You know you don't have to wait up for us anymore. We're big girls.
Eve sat down in the chair at the opposite end of the swing. Eden stood, sipping her drink. Yeah, I know, he said without lifting his head. Have a good night?
It was good. Carrie's fighting with her mother, who's fighting with her two sisters.
Eve laughed.
I guess it's good we don't have family. Can't fight with them if you don't have them.
Well, about that. Ben dropped his hands from the swing chain and shifted. He braced his forearms on his knees. I have a few things to tell you.
You decided to take the job in Pennsylvania after all.
He snorted. That job was the least of his worries. No, he swallowed. But I guess I never mentioned that you have family in Pennsylvania. The girls gasped. Familiar with their brains after so many years together, he spoke before they could attack him with questions. We have 3 half-brothers, their wives, and a grandmother.
No way! You're kidding. Why didn't you tell us? I guess I never mentioned,
Eve parroted in a voice dripping with sarcasm and anger. He ignored their outbursts. Sometimes that was the only way he could deal with them. Your grandmother is in the hospital. They think she had a heart attack, and she's stable. They're doing some testing. They were quiet for a bit, adjusting. Maybe back when they were teens, they might have stomped off, maybe even given him the silent treatment for a while. But thankfully, they'd matured. He hadn't been the best parent in the world, had made tons of mistakes. This was probably one of the biggest.
When a kid has a grandparent, you don't keep it from them,
Eve said in a tone that indicated this was one of the many areas he'd messed up in as a parent. He pulled on the swing chain, flexing his biceps and working some of the frustration out. Eve and Eden had turned out okay. Great, really, in spite of his faults and failures. I'm sorry, he said softly.
An apology really isn't sufficient when we're talking about grandparents.
Eden crossed her arms over her chest. I can't change it. I did what I thought needed to be done in order to protect you.
How is keeping our grandmother away from us protecting us?
Eve used one hand to do air quotes around protecting. Our dad, he hated to speak ill of the dead.
Wait.
Eve still sat on the chair, her tea held, forgotten, in her hands.
We have brothers? Like Dad had.
He had another wife, another whole family in Pennsylvania.
That's illegal.
Eden practically shouted. Yeah. It was wrong on so many levels, but it was illegal as well. Dad was not a good guy. He lied and cheated. He was a drunkard with a nasty temper. He couldn't hold a steady job. I don't want to go on, but yeah, this was one of the things he did that I didn't see the point in telling you about.
But they're our family.
I don't know anything about them. He didn't think he wanted to mention that one of them was in prison. It would help his argument, but it seemed like overkill. They could be just like Dad, and my job was to raise you. I couldn't deal with whatever drama the rest of the family produced. The girls were quiet. Ben closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the chain. I'm sorry. Maybe I should have told you, but I did the best I could. A few seconds ticked by that felt like an eternity. Finally, Eve said,
It's okay, Ben. If you hadn't been here for us, I don't know what would have happened. Yeah,
Eden's voice was small.
I'm sorry I was upset. I guess I was thinking how much I wanted to have a grandmother like my friends had, and cousins and family, but I guess I really don't know what they're like.
And they're so far away, we wouldn't have seen them much anyway, Ben pointed out. Eve popped up. Liquid splashed on the floor.
We've got to go see her. Does she know about us?
Eden asked softly. Ben swallowed, hating to admit the truth but already having to deal with the after effects of one lie, which was one too many. I've talked to her off and on, maybe once a month for the last few years. She really wants to see you, and I've just made excuses.
I can't believe you didn't tell us this.
Eden crossed her arms over her chest. Her voice was shot through with irritation.
I can't believe we haven't gone to see her.
Eve walked over and stood beside her twin. When they did that, it always felt like it was 2 against 1. Always before, he'd stood firm because he knew he was right. This time, he'd been wrong, and he knew it. And now, the worst part. His chest tightened, and his neck crawled. I told her I had a wife, and my wife couldn't travel because of her job. The girls gasped. Eve actually took a step back, her arms falling.
You what?
You heard me.
I did. I just can't believe it. You lied.
Eve put both fists on her hips.
Not only did he lied to our grandmother.
Eden's arms dropped to her sides.
We have a grandmother.
She turned to her twin and threw her arms around her. They danced around in a circle, tea splashing on the floor. Ben smiled a little to see their enthusiasm, but his head drooped down. Eventually, they remembered him. Eve pointed her finger at him.
You are going to have to go right down there and admit to your grandmother that you lied.
Her tone perfectly imitated his the time she'd been in 7th grade and he'd found out she cheated on a test. He'd marched her right into her algebra teacher's classroom and forced her to admit that she'd lied and cheated. It had worked, since she'd never done it again. Unfortunately, he was afraid he was about to get a taste of his own medicine.
No, he's not.
Eden turned and faced him.
Grandmother is in...
She paused.
What do we call her? Grandmother?
Graham, he said without looking up. Eden narrowed her eyes like she was going to give it to him again, but just nodded and continued.
Graham is in the hospital. If we get there before she dies, we don't want her last thought of Ben to be that he lied to her all these years.
Eve tapped a finger on her chin.
I can see your point. He hasn't seen his brothers for years either. It really wouldn't look good to have him show up and be thought a liar first thing.
She glared at Ben.
It's not like he normally lies. I can't remember him ever lying to us, not even about Santa Claus.
Ben gave a little laugh at that. It was true. He'd never lied to the girls, about anything. He was happy about that now. They'd cover for him when he showed up at the hospital without a wife. He could just say she was at home and couldn't get off work. The twins would understand. He'd have to practice because lying wasn't natural to him, but he could do it.
So we have to find him a wife. And fast.
Whoa! Ben's head jerked up. Wait, no. We don't just find wives in a few hours. I've lived 34 years and haven't found anyone I want to be shackled to for the rest of my life. Because it really would be for the rest of his life. He'd lived through divorce and adultery and betrayal. It hurt. He wasn't putting his own kids through that. Not for anything. He wasn't going through it again, either.
You should have thought of that when you decided it was a good idea to lie in the first place,
Eve said in her imitation Ben parenting tone. Ben stood. Okay, you guys are funny. Ha ha. I'll figure out something. In the meantime,
just wait.
Eden said with such authority that he actually stopped and waited. She glanced at her sister, who gave a small nod.
If you want our cooperation, you'll need to find a wife.
Maybe you didn't understand. Graham is in the hospital. She's critical. I don't have time to go wife shopping, even if there were a place where such a thing were for sale.
Ben.
Eden laid a hand on his arm.
You're smart.
She paused.
For a man.
He rolled his eyes. Why was it always boys against girls?
You can figure this out.
His mind went completely blank. Figure this out? What in the world? He blinked at them, feeling like he'd stepped into a different degree of reality. Not an uncommon feeling since he'd stepped into the parenting role when their mother died. He ran a hand through his hair. I guess you give me too much credit. I have no idea what you two are talking about. Women. They did this to him all the time. Most of the time, he knew he was right and ignored them. This time, since he'd been the one to lie to begin with, he wasn't sure where the line was. Eve laughed. She put her hand on his other arm.
Think about it, Ben. We know a woman who wants something from you so bad, she'd pretend to be your wife in order to get it.
Ben shook his head. He didn't know any woman who wanted... Her image popped into his head. Riley. His heart slammed against his ribs like an unsecured load at a stop sign. He closed his eyes. The knot in his stomach that had burned since he'd gotten Cassidy's call loosened. His lips actually turned up.
Oh, he's liking the idea.
He couldn't argue with them, but he didn't want them to see him capitulate too easily. They might suspect the truth that lay buried in his soul. He threw out the first thing that came to mind. That means I would have to move to Pennsylvania. He'd have to take the job. There really wasn't any part of him that was disappointed about that. It didn't matter how badly she'd humiliated him. Didn't matter that she'd paraded her daddy-approved boyfriend down the walk in front of him. Didn't matter that she'd said he'd never be good enough. There would only ever be one woman his soul burnt for.
We'll move with you.
He narrowed his eyes at them, not totally ignorant of their tricks. You two have been talking about this. Eve grinned.
We have. We actually didn't have any friends with us tonight. It was just the two of us having a powwow about how to get you to accept Riley's offer.
You want to move to Pennsylvania? He asked. The thought had never entered his head. They eyed each other and looked down.
Not exactly.
Spit it, he said, wrapping an arm around each of their shoulders. It hadn't been easy raising them, but it was easy loving them.
We wanted you to give Riley a chance.
His smile slipped. They didn't know the history between him and Riley. It wasn't really about him giving her a chance. She'd been clear what she wanted, and she'd never indicated her feelings had changed. How could they? She'd been his boss. Wicked thoughts flew through his mind. A chance. Right. He hid his evil grin. This would be a way to get back at her. Not that he'd ever been into revenge, but hey, She had thought she was so much better than he was. It would serve her right to have to marry him in order to turn her daddy's shop around and get her corner office promotion. Could he do that? Could he really stand in front of her and insist that she'd have to marry him to get his help? Riley could turn him down flat. Marriage was a huge step. She might agree to pretend to be married, but that wouldn't satisfy him. No, it would be too easy for her to walk away. If they didn't have the history between them, he might be okay with a flat exchange, a pretend marriage that was mutually beneficial. But he had an axe to grind, and if he were going to help her, she needed to double pay to cover what she'd done. Yeah, a real marriage, one that could be annulled when he moved away from Pennsylvania to start his own business, or no deal. That way she'd be tied to him, humbled. She'd said he wasn't good enough, and her dad had been standing right beside her. It would be sweet revenge to see her dad's face when he found out that his precious daughter had lowered herself to marry him. He didn't exactly like the idea that marrying him was a punishment, but he did enjoy the irony of the whole situation. And he had the twins' support. It was hard to resist his evil nature. The biggest drawback was that the reason he'd lied in the first place was because he didn't want to be like his dad, going from woman to woman to woman. He wanted to be seen as steady and dependable, moral. This would shoot that in the foot. But he didn't know what his family was like. If they were decent people, he'd just have to find the courage to tell them he'd lied. And if they weren't, he wouldn't ever need to tell them. He'd just disappear again. They would never need to know that the whole thing had been a sham. He narrowed his eyes at the twins. He'd never lied to them. They'd never seen him be dishonest. He didn't like the idea that they would see it now, but he knew they knew his character. Plus, for some reason, they were stuck on Riley. So, in a way, he could even give them what they wanted. The only thing he'd probably end up lying about would be how long Riley and he'd been married. "I'll think about it," he finally said to them. "In the meantime, plan on going to class in the morning and making whatever arrangements you can to be away for a few days. You need to go see your Gram. I want to be on the road to Pennsylvania sometime after noon tomorrow. Married to Riley or not?" Chapter 8. Riley dropped into her chair behind her small desk at 7:30 the next morning. She put her head down on the smooth surface. Normally, she came into the office rejuvenated and ready to face the new day. Ready for the problems, because there were always problems. She loved the challenge of figuring out solutions, saving money, making people happy, because happy people worked better than unhappy people. Plus, it was just nice to be around happy people. But this problem. She reached down, without lifting her head, to dig her laptop out of her bag. In between packing up her apartment, trying to find a replacement for herself here in Maine, getting a jump on the issues in Pennsylvania, and spending more than a little time trying to figure out how to get Ben to change his mind, she'd gone over the files Audrey had given her, setting up interviews for next Monday. She couldn't trust this all-important hire to the normal channels. There were more than 50 files, and they all looked like good prospects. But a person could look great on paper. It wasn't that hard to fill up a good resume. Ben, he wouldn't look half as good as some of these guys on an application, but the things that made Ben good at what he did were things that an application couldn't show. How could she know if any of the applicants could relate to a working man's problems, that they'd know how far and hard to push and when to back off and give a helping hand, that they'd go the extra mile, showing up early, staying late, inspiring devotion and loyalty as Ben did. It wasn't even something that would show up in an interview. She'd just have to wait and see after they were hired. But she didn't have time to go through a bunch of employees that weren't exemplary. She needed someone like Ben, and she needed them today. She groaned. Maybe Audrey was right, and she tried too hard to please her dad. She'd stop right after she got this promotion, if she got this promotion. A rap on her door startled her, and she jerked up, her hand automatically going to smooth her hair down. She cleared her throat and schooled her features. She had no idea who'd be coming to her office this early in the morning. It definitely wasn't Audrey, who knocked with a gentle tap-tap. She opened her laptop, thinking to give the impression that she'd been working. "Come in," she called. Her heart jumped into her throat when Ben walked in the door, his ball cap in his hand. He'd never come to her office without being summoned. Ever. She tamped down a rise of excitement. Maybe he'd decided to take her offer. It had to be the money. Triple his current salary was a lot of money to a man like Ben. It hadn't been very often that she'd seen him without his hat on in the past few years. Some guys' hats hid a bald head. Ben's hair was full and just long enough to show a tendency to wave. His features were dark, those brown eyes unreadable. The short stubble gave him a slightly dangerous look, which should not do anything for her but caused her heart to knock against her ribs. His face gave nothing away. "You can sit down," she said, surprised that her voice sounded almost normal. He stepped toward her desk. "No thanks, I'll stand." She inclined her head. "Okay." He studied her, and she met his gaze, refusing to back down or be the first to speak. He'd sought her out. He could talk when he was ready. Maybe he was worried about her replacement, that they wouldn't give him the freedom that he'd had under her. Whatever. She wasn't going to make small talk just to put him at ease. The seconds ticked by, and the underlying current she always felt when Ben was anywhere near her intensified. She struggled not to squirm in her chair. "I'll go to Pennsylvania." Her eyes widened. She stood, her hands on her desk, leaning forward. "Really?" she squeaked. She had been expecting it, but it still shocked her somehow. He didn't look like a man who was giving in. "Yeah, it shouldn't take more than 6 months to get that shop headed in the right direction." He jerked his head slightly, and for the first time, she noticed his knuckles were white as he gripped his hat. "But I have one condition." "What's that?" she asked. He could tell her he wanted her to pack 6 moose and a rhinoceros and take them down with her, and she'd do it. "While I'm there, you'll be my wife." Chapter 9. Riley blinked. Her body stiffened like a hunk of meat in the freezer. Ben looked completely serious. He wasn't smiling, and there didn't seem to be a punchline. She dated. Not a ton, since her heart and life were her work, and she hadn't found a man who convinced her there was anything better. Except Ben. When they'd been together, she'd felt like she would have given up everything to be with him. But in the end, she'd given him up instead. But married? She narrowed her eyes and tilted her head, picking up her pencil so her fingers had something to do. He seemed actually quite serious. "You want to marry me?" "Not really," he said casually, and it felt like an insult. "But my gram is in the hospital, and my family thinks I'm married. The Coleman shop in Pennsylvania is right outside the town my family lives in. I'm not showing up down there without a wife." So many questions bubbled around in her head. Why did his family think he was married? Why not tell them that he wasn't? Was he actually married? That one seemed important to her befuddled brain.
You're not married to anyone else?
His jaw muscles clenched, and a vein bulged in his neck. Even an idiot like myself knows that's illegal. She hadn't meant to insult him. Obviously, he was sensitive about it, and she couldn't blame him. Not with their history.
I didn't mean it like that. I just don't understand why your family thinks you're married.
He shrugged it off. It doesn't matter.
You want to get married for real?
I'm not going to tell them you're my wife when you really aren't. His jaw set in a stubborn line, like he expected her to challenge him. Silence descended. She took a breath.
We could pretend.
His eyes settled on her once again. Married for real. That's my offer. Take it or leave it. There was a beat of silence, but before she could say anything, he added, If you leave it, that's fine. Consider this my 2-week notice. The pencil point snapped. She pried her fingers off and set the pencil down deliberately. Ben was quitting? Racking her brain for coherent thought, she said,
You can't just plan a wedding on the spur of the moment. I'd need at least 6 months.
He shook his head. Won't work. I'm going to Pennsylvania this afternoon. We can go to the courthouse and get hitched first, or I'll go to PA alone. If I do, I'll see my family, then I'm headed to Montana to start my own business.
But your 2-week notice.
I'll be using personal days, and Paul has agreed to cover for me. She'd allowed them the ability to do that on occasion. Obviously, he was taking advantage of it now. He stood in front of her, tall and dark and quiet. The idea of working without him had given her an empty feeling inside. She didn't work side by side with him, but in the summer, she saw him every day through the open garage door. She caught occasional glimpses of him on security cameras, which were attached to her computer, and during meetings and such. They were a team, both of them pulling together. They'd been able to complement each other like no one else she'd ever been around. But marry him. Sure, there was this crazy attraction, but that wasn't enough to build a marriage on. Wait.
You said you could have it headed in the right direction in 6 months.
Yeah?
What about after that?
If it needs more help, I'm not opposed to staying longer.
So you'll only stay for 6 months or until it's performing at the top?
Yeah.
Then what?
That's when I'll leave to start my own business.
So you're leaving either way?
Yep.
What about me? Our marriage?
A shadow flickered over his face, gone before she could examine it. It's not going to be a real marriage. We'll get it annulled. I'm just not lying to my family while I'm there. Not any more than I have to. He paused, and the word again seemed to whisper in the air around him. If I have a woman standing beside me and I say she's my wife, she's going to be my wife. It was crazy. She shouldn't be considering it. Why was she even asking questions about it? But she knew. Because pleasing her dad and working for his company had been all she'd ever known. Maybe she was also giving in to the pull that Ben had always exerted on her. Not that their marriage was going to mean anything. Of course, there was still the problem that existed all those years ago when she'd walked away from him the first time. This time, though, her dad wouldn't have anything to hold over her head. Nothing that would hurt Ben, anyway. Before she could use rational sense, before she could chicken out, she straightened.
I'll do it.
Riley placed her phone on speaker as she packed the last of the things she was taking from her office. It rang and rang. This was why she hardly ever called her mom. Her mom never answered. Seemed like she was always out doing something. She'd text later, apologizing for missing her call, saying she was out somewhere. Had Riley called her mom even twice this year? But marriage, even a fake one, was a big step, and Riley just felt like she needed to get her mother's opinion on it. Not permission, not even acceptance. Her mother wouldn't know Ben. But she supposed there were certain times in a woman's life when she needed her mom. Marriage was one of those times. Even if it wasn't going to be real. Maybe especially if it wasn't going to be real. Okay, maybe she just wasn't sure that what she was doing was a great idea, and she needed to talk to someone. Someone who lived life to the fullest and wasn't afraid to take chances. She could hardly call friends she barely spoke to anymore for advice on a fake marriage. Her mom's voicemail came on. Riley swiped off, not even considering leaving a message. Disappointment swirled in her chest, a familiar feeling when she was dealing with her mother. She tapped her finger on the edge of the box she'd filled with her personal items. Then she picked up her phone and found her dad's contact. He picked up on the second ring. "What?"
I just wanted to tell you I'll be in Pennsylvania tonight. I've already arranged housing at the business-owned farmhouse. I'll be in to work tomorrow.
"Good. I'll see that your office is ready. The woman you're replacing left last week."
My replacement has been hired, and I'm taking over all employment decisions at the PA terminal.
"I'll make sure the staff understands," her dad said brusquely. Her dad hated Ben. That's why she'd already taken care of his employment at the Brickley Springs terminal. It was something her dad would find out eventually, but that didn't need to be today. Hopefully, it would be after they'd started getting the shop to perform. She supposed moms and dads were different. She'd never really been around her mom much. Still, she wasn't tempted to tell her dad about her marriage at all. Most of that was probably because he'd blow a gasket if he found out she was going to marry Ben, but also because he just wouldn't be interested. The way she got his attention was by performing. Maybe she thought her mom would be different. She should have known her mom wouldn't answer. She drew her attention back to their conversation.
Thanks, that'll be helpful. I'll be able to hit the ground running.
"I wouldn't expect anything else."
I haven't met my replacement. She's not arriving until Monday.
Ben hadn't given her a choice when she was leaving. She wanted to get moving, so she hadn't put up a fight about it. Or maybe she'd just been too shell-shocked about the fact that she'd actually agreed to get married. To Ben.
Audrey will handle everything.
"That's good. Hire yourself a secretary when you come down, or two if you need. You know you have the freedom to make any and all changes you need."
Thanks, Dad.
"Sure. Whatever it takes to pull this terminal up. I want it to be the top-performing shop when the investors show up. I gotta go." He hung up without saying goodbye. Riley sighed, looking down at her phone. She'd never done anything that had garnered her mother's attention, but she knew what it took to impress her dad. She looked at the box and squared her shoulders. Maybe she was crazy, but getting married to someone she barely knew wasn't too much to do if it meant she'd succeed in her dad's eyes. Although she had to admit she wouldn't have married just anyone. Ben had always been different than other men to her. She knew she could trust him, and she knew he had what it took to turn the terminal around. She was just putting the last of her things into the final box when Eve pushed her office door open and looked around.
Good morning, Riley. I know you're probably busy, but do you have a minute? I sure do. Come on in.
She was packed and ready to go. She had a moving company come to her apartment earlier in the week, taking some things to storage and some to Pennsylvania. She just had a few suitcases.
Actually, I was just finishing up here, and I'm glad for something to pass the time.
Eve stepped in.
Come on in and sit down.
Riley indicated two comfortable chairs in the corner of her office that angled toward each other.
These are pretty comfortable. I'm going to miss them.
Eve smiled.
Ben's already been in to see you? Yes.
Riley gave her a direct look.
And you said... I agreed.
Something that looked like relief went over Eve's face. Then she looked at her lap, turning her phone over and over in her hands, like an alligator death roll. She looked very young when she finally lifted her head and spoke.
I want to ask you a question, but it's personal.
Riley kept her expression clear, although a little chill ran down her spine.
Okay. You don't have to answer.
She gave a half smile. The chill reached out and wrapped around her ribs.
Okay. Something happened between you and Ben a long time ago. Eden and I have figured that much out, but Ben won't talk. Will you tell me?
Riley blew a breath out. She hesitated because it was really Ben's story to tell. Riley was the bad guy, but maybe Ben hadn't wanted to talk bad about her. She could see Ben holding it in because of that. Really, she could. So it would fall to her to tell the story. But the twins might hate her, and she liked Eden and Eve a lot. She walked to the coffee maker that she was leaving for the next occupant and poured herself a cup.
Would you like some? No, thank you.
Riley held the cup in her hand and started toward her chair.
I don't want you to hate me. I won't, I promise.
She smiled.
You'll think less of me, I know, but I guess I deserve it.
She took a sip of her coffee, then realized she hadn't put any cream or sugar in it.
Ugh!
She got back up.
Back when we were in high school, well, even before that, I think Ben was around 14 when he moved up to Maine. He actually ran away from his home.
Eve stated it like it was a fact everyone knew. Riley poured the creamer in her coffee.
I didn't know that until recently.
Her heart clenched. She stood still, picturing Ben, determined and angry, making his way to his mother. Yes, she could see it. Nothing could have stopped him from going to be with her once he found out about her. Even at 14. Her heart pinched for the boy he'd been.
I just knew he showed up in school about 9th grade. He was gorgeous. He still is,
Eve said.
True,
Riley giggled.
I guess I'm getting married to him. I can admit that, right?
Eve laughed.
I won't tell him you said so. He knows it. Actually, I don't think he does.
Riley couldn't imagine he didn't.
Anyway, we had class together, and when he learned that my dad owned a trucking company, he asked me if I could get him permission to hang around the garage.
She shrugged.
So I did.
They'd talked in class some and met once behind the bleachers. She couldn't even remember what for. Maybe for her to return the hat he'd left in class or something. Something innocent. But after that first time, they'd just kind of shown up there every morning, and for 20 minutes or so, they'd talked. Completely innocent. He'd never kissed her. It wasn't like they made out behind the bleachers. Nothing like that. But one morning that spring, he'd asked her to go to the prom with him. She'd said yes, with fireworks shooting out of her heart and her entire being thrilled that the boy she was falling for had asked her out. They never walked the halls together, except for that one history class, They were in completely different rooms and tracks. They'd never gone steady or any of the other things that her friends did. Ben was different. That was part of his attraction.
And he learned mechanical stuff from being around the mechanics at Coleman?
Eve asked, interrupting her thoughts.
Yes, he did. It was the best thing he could have done. And you helped him. How does that make you look bad? Oh, our story doesn't end there.
If only.
No?
She sat a little straighter on the chair.
Keep going.
Riley tapped her cup.
So, your mom had you two, and also Ben, and of course, your dad didn't do much in the way of support. I know Ben said Mom didn't want to rock the boat and endanger Eden and me, so she didn't insist on child support.
Riley nodded.
I think that's the way lots of women feel. What was she like?
Eve asked softly. Riley barely remembered Ben's mother.
She was beautiful, gentle, quiet. I remember her as a real lady. You didn't have a mom?
Eve wrinkled her nose.
Not really. I mean, I do. She's with her 5th husband and living in the Bahamas. She didn't want me.
Riley took a drink of coffee to disguise the hurt in her heart.
That's sad. Yeah, anyway.
It was ancient history, and she just had to deal with it.
When her lupus started getting worse, Ben was beside himself. He was 15 and he wanted to work, to help provide since your mother had to quit her job. She was a waitress. But he was too young. And? So, I told you, I helped him get a job. Dad was already grooming me to work in his business. From the time I could walk, I followed him around the company. I knew the ins and outs. I'd worked there every summer since I could read. Anyway, I falsified Ben's birth certificate, made him older than he was, and I made sure he got hired for second shift. Back then, the main terminal was our only terminal. It wasn't until I graduated from high school that Dad expanded and moved and Pennsylvania became our home base. So Ben was able to go to school and also work.
Eve pushed her hair back behind her ear. Her face was still open and friendly. They hadn't gotten to the bad part of the story yet.
Yep. No one found out. People knew, but they also knew the situation with your mom and that she couldn't work and she had you two. No one said anything.
Eve looked thoughtful.
Nope.
She shrugged.
I still don't see how you're the bad guy.
Riley swallowed.
It's coming. Trust me. Okay. Like I said, people knew, but Ben was good at what he did. It wasn't long until he had to turn down a promotion to day shift, even. But your mom got worse. She died.
Eve said it matter-of-factly with a lifted shoulder. Riley supposed it was just a fact of life to her. She'd been very young when it happened.
Eventually. But Ben and I...
How did she explain what they were? Friends, yeah, kind of.
We didn't really date, but we liked each other. I knew he liked me, and I really liked him.
She smiled. She had really, really liked him.
But Ben had a lot of responsibility on his shoulders, and he was working all the time. And you don't really know my dad, but he had plans for me that didn't include me getting mixed up with a mechanic from the shop. And I knew that.
Eve's brows drew down.
Ben wasn't good enough for him? Yeah, that's basically it.
And nothing had changed. At all.
Ben asked me to go to prom with him, and I said yes. He was coming to my house to pick me up. But my dad found out. I think it was the day before. He got one of his business friends to have their son come take me.
She fingered her cup. She couldn't even remember the boy's name. He'd just finished his second year of college, and her dad thought pretty highly of him.
My dad was furious that I'd been kind of seeing Ben, a mechanic. I didn't usually buck him, but I was a little defiant about Ben.
She'd really, really liked him.
I was a teenager, and I was all like, "But I love him, Daddy." But Dad said if I ever spoke to him again, Dad would make sure he got fired and never work for Coleman Trucking again. Furthermore, he said he would make sure that he never worked as a mechanic again.
She'd believed him at the time.
Looking back, I don't know if he could have done that, but I do know that Ben needed that job. His mother was dying and he had twin sisters to raise, and his dad was a deadbeat. I was scared that Ben would lose you two, and I knew he'd be devastated over that.
Eve nodded. She knew what was at stake for Ben.
Dad made sure I understood that the break needed to be permanent. I wasn't to string him along or have him come to me asking if I'd changed my mind or anything. Dad promised me that he would keep his job. He promised that he'd even get a pay raise, but I could never have contact with him again. First time he caught Ben trying to talk to me, even if I didn't answer him, he was terminated.
Eve's eyes got big and her knuckles whitened as she held her phone.
Wow, that's harsh. I know he was probably trying to protect me and trying to do what was best for me.
Actually, she really wasn't sure, but she hoped it was true.
Maybe.
Riley shrugged. It didn't make any difference at this point in time.
Dad insisted I go to the dance with that other boy. He insisted that I walk out the door on his arm, with all of my friends and their dates behind me. Man, there must have been 20 of us.
Her voice trailed off. She could still see Ben standing there, unable to afford to rent a tux, but looking better than anyone she'd ever seen in clean jeans and a nice white collared shirt, a bouquet of grocery store flowers in his hand. It had been the hardest thing she'd ever done in her life to stop with her hand holding on to the arm of another boy and tell Ben all the things her dad had told her to. But when they'd met in the mornings, he'd talked with pride, affection, and deep love about his twin sisters and the promises he'd made to his mother to take care of them. She couldn't be the reason he'd lost it all. It was one of the hardest things she'd ever done. I told Ben he was a fool for thinking that I might actually go somewhere in public with him. She took a breath.
I said he wasn't good enough for me and never would be. I called him white trash and scumball and a bunch of other insults. He stood there. Yeah, he stood there. My dad stood at the door, smiling. My friends laughed behind me. I smiled back at my dad, so Ben would know that he wasn't making me do it. Wow, that was harsh.
Eve repeated her earlier phrase, only with more heat this time. Her eyes narrowed at Riley. Riley figured she wouldn't be her favorite person in the world after she confessed what a horrible person she'd been.
It was.
It was so very harsh.
But it worked. Ben is still working for our company. So when did you tell Ben that your dad made you do it? I never did. What?
Eve almost jumped out of her chair.
What's the point? So he'd know you really didn't mean it? That you didn't think he was worthless? That you did what you did because you truly cared for him?
Eve's eyes were big, her cheeks red. Riley looked away. How could she? So much time had passed. She'd actually thought about it when she first came back from college and they worked here together. but they hardly ever saw one another, and days slipped into weeks and years. She'd been tempted to just confront him, but he was still caring for the twins and she was still trying to please her dad and move up in the company. Whatever they'd had in high school was long over. There'd always been attraction to Ben, but soon she became his boss, so it didn't matter anyway. Did it? She couldn't change it. As though Eve realized where her thoughts were headed, she said,
"It's not what you did. It's that you never told him any different. Once he was no longer in danger of losing his job, that's just it. You two just started making your own money and working for yourselves. Up until this very point in time, me being seen with Ben could have caused him to lose everything he's worked for. It still could." "Do you really think your dad would still fire Ben? Does he really hate him that much?" "It's not about hating him. Dad doesn't hate him. It's more about controlling me, I think. Dad wants me to end up with someone who will sit at the head of the corporate meeting table and take over the reins from him, not someone with grease on his hands and no college diploma in his pocket. It's so hard to believe that your dad would be that awful."
Eve leaned back in her chair, rubbing her chin. Finally, she asked hesitantly,
"Do you still have feelings for Ben?"
Riley hesitated.
"I like him. Of course I do. I admire him too. Who else would have sacrificed what he has to raise his sisters alone?" "I think you deliberately misunderstood me."
Riley took a big gulp of her coffee and searched her brain for something to change the subject with. But Eve wouldn't let it go.
"There was a spark there once. Do you think you could love my brother?"
Riley couldn't be anything but honest.
"I think it'd be easy to love your brother."
She would never have agreed to enter into a fake marriage with just anyone. The idea of being fake married to any other guy she knew was repulsive.
"But I think you can tell from my story that the real question is, could your brother possibly love me? Especially after what I've done to him. The things I told you that I said and did, I really said and did them. How could he ever forgive or forget?"
Eve's lips flattened.
"And you had a good point. Surely, at some time, I could have, should have, gone to him and admitted what I did. I could have gone behind my dad's back or even risked getting Ben fired. But even though it was something I wanted to do, I never did. And yes, I didn't want Ben to lose his job when he was supporting you two. But I know there's also a part of me that doesn't want to disappoint my dad."
She felt it long and strong every time her dad wanted her to do something for him. She'd worked herself to death to make him happy.
"I've worked so hard for what I have, even though my dad is the owner. But also, my whole life has been making choices that make Dad happy."
Riley studied Eve.
"You don't want to disappoint Ben." "No."
A little light dawned in her eyes.
"That's true. Don't forget, my mom didn't want me. She left and didn't even bother to take her daughter with her. That's not something a girl forgets. And I'm sure it's affected how much I crave my dad's approval, since getting my mom's love was never an option."
Even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were true. It was why she'd stood on the step all those years ago and did exactly what her dad wanted. Eve nodded.
"I hate how complicated everything is. Eden and I were holding out hope that you and Ben would fall in love and stay together. You're great for him, and we've always kind of felt he has feelings for you."
Did he? How could she not see that?
"I don't know about that, but I do know that he could have feelings and still not trust me, or even like me. At the very least, I think you should tell Ben why you dumped him and in such a mean way. It's only fair that he know it wasn't him, and it wasn't because he wasn't good enough.
Eve was right, of course. And she'd tried. It had never worked. Now it was done and over with, and he wasn't interested in going back. She had to let it go. Chapter 10. Ben was still somewhat in shock as he drove his pickup to the courthouse. He hadn't expected Riley to say yes. Not really. He'd made his demands as unreasonable as possible. That she do it today, that they leave for Pennsylvania this afternoon, that he was only in for 6 months. That last didn't sit well. He didn't know what kind of vows he'd be saying in a few minutes, but he'd never given his word lightly. It hardly seemed right to start now, entering into the most sacred of God's covenants with man. Unfortunately, he'd not thought of that earlier. He'd been too eager to exact his version of revenge. He hadn't been to too many weddings, but he was pretty sure there were some promises to love and cherish for as long as they both lived. Man, he hated to say he'd do it and all the while be planning on not. Cold feet, that's what his doubts were called, right? Riley sat beside him, her hands in her lap, staring out the window. He could admit that he'd dreamed more than once about Riley being beside him, not just in his pickup, but anywhere. But in his dreams, there had never been this strained silence between them. Nor was there this almost animosity. The underlying buzz of attraction, yeah, definitely that was the same. But in his dreams, she liked him. He pulled into the courthouse parking lot. The lowered clouds and dark sky reflected the mood in the truck. He wouldn't want Eve's or Eden's wedding day to be like this, even if it were a fake marriage. His sisters had better not have a fake marriage. He pulled into a parking space and turned to Riley. "You know, you don't have to do this." She turned, her heart-shaped chin lifted in challenge.
Cold feet?
Heck yeah. I don't want to do this and have you hate me. Her surprise was real.
Why would I hate you? You're doing me a favor.
You haven't said a word on the drive here. With the twins, if they weren't talking, that meant they were mad. Always his fault.
Neither have you.
The twins never noticed if he wasn't talking. Not usually, anyway. I was thinking, he said, not liking the defensive tone that crept into his voice.
Me too.
She lifted a brow in challenge.
Happy thoughts about how we're going to turn the world upside down in Pennsylvania.
Confident much?
I've got you.
He caught his breath. His heart stumbled. She was that confident in him? She wanted him to help her so badly she was willing to marry him when she didn't even like him in order to do it? Marry him with only a few hours' notice and move 8 hours away? Something in his chest expanded, low and deep. She really believed in him. Once, a long time ago, she might have tossed his love in the trash like yesterday's leftovers, but she really did believe in him.
Don't worry, she said. I'll make sure your family thinks we've been married for how long?
4 years. That would cover the lie he'd told Graham.
4 years. And we don't want kids?
He paused in the act of reaching for the door latch, looking over at Riley. There was no hidden meaning in her words, but they'd struck something inside of him. Would their kids have her hazel eyes that changed with her moods? His dark hair? Her delicate bone structure, her easy smile, his attention to detail, her stubborn determination. Oh, God help them if anyone's children were as stubbornly determined as Riley was to earn her spot at the top of her dad's trucking company. He shrugged, looking away, not wanting to say anything that would make this day any worse than what it already was. I guess not. We don't have any. She laughed a little at that. Just something more than a snort, but it froze him again. Her laughter. It hit him deep inside, in that spot that felt warm. It pulsed there, spreading quiet joy throughout his whole body. His fingertips tingled. He wanted to hear it again, wanted to see her smile. For goodness sake, it was her wedding day. It wasn't real. He turned and yanked the door latch. Let's get this over with. Riley walked to the steps of the courthouse, very conscious of the large man beside her. He seemed fine, just another day for him. On the other hand, her internal organs had staged a revolt, and her heart was snapping the whip behind them. On the top step, Ben touched her arm. Hang on. He turned and jogged back down the stairs, crossing the street and getting in the glove box of his pickup. He held a small package in his hand as he came back up the stairs. Her face crinkled. A ring, he said simply. She nodded. She'd been in the courthouse once or twice before for jury duty, so the metal detectors and the serious-faced, uniformed guard at the entrance were not a surprise. Today, though, she didn't enjoy the ornate molding and the huge, high ceilings, didn't admire the intricate carved woodwork of a century past when a man actually made his living making beautiful things out of native lumber for the sole purpose of making the inside of a living area look resplendent and classy. Normally, she loved admiring the handiwork of generations ago, even if it had nothing at all to do with her and the job she did. But today, as she walked down the expansive hall, every little noise echoing against the walls, she wondered how many other couples had taken this same walk. The courthouse seemed to be the place to go if your marriage wasn't exactly a love match. Ben and she were not the first to walk these halls, 6 inches of space between them, not talking, not even planning on taking their vows seriously or keeping them. Her hand accidentally brushed his, and he jerked it away. She pretended not to notice, even as her heart contracted. What was she getting into? She was marrying a man who, if he didn't hate her, at least loathed her, and for good reason. She felt like she was walking through a cloud as they showed their ID to the bored-looking lady at the desk and signed the proper papers. The woman didn't even look up as she said, "Sit down over there. I'll call you when the judge can take 5 minutes." 5 minutes. An annoyance for the judge. A life change for her. Blindly, she followed Ben to the hard wooden chairs along the wall. These were probably hand-carved too, and on any other day, she would have admired the workmanship. Ben sat with legs apart and leaned his forearms on his knees. She lowered herself primly beside him, crossing her legs and resisting the urge to pull her phone out. She couldn't handle reading the news headlines right now, but a game where she got to shoot lots of things might be good stress relief. Gripping her purse with fingers that wanted to shake, she stared at the wall and concentrated on taking deep, relaxing breaths. Ben might not like her, but he wasn't a monster. He was a good man, and in return for her suffering through this, he was going to make the shop in Brickley Springs profitable again. His hands were folded in front of him, and he looked as relaxed as a man who had nothing more on his mind than thinking about the contents of his toolbox. She wished it were that easy for her. Finally, The woman at the desk called them and directed them back through big, heavy wooden doors. Ben opened one and held it for her.
"Thank you,"
she murmured. He grunted. A man with thinning gray hair, apparently the judge, stood behind his desk. He wore a white dress shirt with no tie and a pair of dress pants. No robe. He came around the desk with a small book in his hand. He held his other hand out to them. "I'm Judge Crocker. You two are here to get married?" His smile revealed straight white teeth. "Yes, sir," Ben answered as Riley nodded. She made sure her handshake was firm and confident, and she reached deep inside her for the fake confidence she always used with her dad. Maybe it was a mistake, but she wasn't going to make herself sick thinking about it. The decision had been made. Now she was going to jump head first in. The judge looked between the two of them, like he was looking for some sign that showed they actually wanted what they said they wanted. Ben's expression didn't change. He stood solid and strong beside her. She lifted her chin a fraction of an inch and met the judge's eyes with a small smile. "Okay, well, we'll get started then. Face each other and clasp right hands." It took Riley 3 seconds to figure out which hand was her right. She clasped Ben's waiting hand. A small shock went through her. His hand was rough and hard, big, strong. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second as invisible currents of something hot and prickly shot between them. For the first time since he'd made his offer, Ben's face showed something besides complete control. It was just a widening of his eyes, a twitch of his lips, but she was sure whatever shock she felt, he'd felt it too. It wasn't her imagination either, that the hold of his hand lightened and cool air seeped between their hands. He seemed to be holding it with 2 fingers, like he'd hold a pail of garbage that he didn't really want to touch. She tried not to be offended. The judge's words flowed past her, and she responded at the proper time, not really paying attention until he asked for a ring. Ben reached into his front pocket and pulled out a small package of O-rings. Riley's eyes widened slightly as he broke the little bag and pulled out one of the rubber rings. The judge, who had probably thought he'd seen it all, stood with his mouth slightly open, watching Ben's hands as he slid the black band onto her left hand. Judge Crocker shook his head slightly and continued with the vows. Riley supposed it was a good thing she hadn't been able to get a hold of her mother. If her mother asked her anything at all, she'd want to know about the size of her ring. She fingered the odd-feeling rubber band as the judge pronounced them man and wife. Rather than telling Ben to kiss his bride, he turned to his desk and pointed to the paper on it. "Sign this." It stated they were married, until death do them part. She supposed it should have said, until the Coleman trucking terminal is running in the black at the top of the company again, but there wasn't enough room. It didn't really have a good ring to it anyway. She signed and watched as Ben picked up the pen in his capable fingers and drew his bold signature over the correct line. And that was it. They walked out, married, and she tried not to be upset because it seemed like just another day at the office to everyone else in the courthouse. Just because it was special to her, she pushed that thought away. It was a fake marriage. It shouldn't be special. They walked out to the pickup. Ben opened her door without saying anything, then closed it behind her and got in on his side. They'd already loaded the stuff from her apartment, and they were ready to take off for Brickley Springs. "You hungry?" Ben's voice broke into her thoughts, deep and clear, confident. It was a voice that soothed her and gave her courage.
"Not really."
She hadn't had an appetite since he'd made his suggestion this morning. At one time, She'd dreamed of marrying him. Never like this. I'm going to stop for fast food then. He turned toward her. I'll take you somewhere nice, though, if you want. He looked back out the windshield at the town streets. I know it's not real, but it was your first marriage, and it's not every day that a girl gets married. Plus, his fingers did a slow tap on the steering wheel. We need to get used to the idea that we have to look real. He slowed for a red light. Anyway, I'll take you out if you want. It was on the tip of her tongue to say that she made more money than he did, and if anyone were taking anyone out, it would be her paying for his meal, but she shut her mouth hard. Ben looked confident and almost invincible, but he had a lot of pride, and a man's pride was easily bruised. She'd taken that pride and smashed it once. She wasn't making that mistake again. Not if she could help it.
Thanks for the offer.
She appreciated the consideration.
I'm really not hungry.
His lips flattened, and he pulled toward the nearest drive-thru. She looked out the window, unsure what she'd done that had made him look so irritated with her. He ordered and ate while he drove. The time and distance slipped by. She allowed herself a little bit of time to adjust, time to be sorry that her wedding day hadn't even come close to what she'd dreamed of. But after an hour or so, she'd done enough wallowing. They needed to face the future, and they needed a plan.
I helped raise the twins, right?
For the last 4 years, I guess you did. She half expected him to not answer, so she was surprised when he shifted in his seat, glancing over, his dark sunglasses and beard stubble making him look rugged and handsome. Her heart swished in her chest. For now, he was hers. The thought made her smile. She liked the idea that this rugged, capable man belonged to her.
I didn't give you a ring.
I couldn't wear one anyway, not in the shop. I'd lose my finger.
Oh.
She looked back out the window. There was so much she didn't know. Not just about him, but about what he did, despite the fact that she worked in the same company and her dad owned it. Maybe she'd never know.
I'm surprised the twins weren't at our wedding. Aren't they going to Pennsylvania too?
It wasn't real. There wasn't any reason for them to be there. He tapped the steering wheel again. They're coming down, but I guess they needed more than a couple of hours to pack.
They're going to close up the house?
Kind of. I'll need to go back for my toolbox.
Couldn't you just put it in the back?
She looked over her shoulder. There was plenty of room in the bed of his pickup. He snorted. No way. I might even hire someone to bring it down.
It's that special?
Yeah. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't ask any more questions. They should know more about each other, but he didn't seem interested in knowing anything about her, and she was tired. She leaned her head against the window and fell asleep. Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out the playlist with all our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.